Welcome to Gatekeeper episode 171. אם אתם מאזינים לנו באודיו ולא נוח לכם בשפה האנגלית, אנא עברו ליוטיוב. שם יש כותרות בעברית. And today it is indeed my unique pleasure to have Miranda Devine on the show. Thanks, Miranda, for making the time.
Pleasure, Gadi. Shalom.
Shalom. And Miranda, for those of my listeners who haven't yet heard me speak about her, which I did, is the journalist who first broke out the Hunter Biden story and is also the author of this amazing book, Laptop from Hell. Let me show this on the screen for a minute. I will in a minute. So, since this is all the whole episode, the whole sprawling story, not episode of the laptop and the Biden family is so complicated. Why don't we start for an Israeli audience from how did this story fall in your lap?
Well, I'm working for the New York Post as a columnist, and I had cultivated Rudy Giuliani, the former mayor who had become President Trump's confidant and personal lawyer when I first got to New York in 2019. And so he had been trying to get somebody in the media to get interested in this story, but he was being selective. He only wanted it to go to people who would understand it and not try and bury it. So he wasn't going to the New York Times or the Washington Post. And he was just about to give it, I believe, to the Daily Mail, having tried to get it to the New York Post through another of my colleagues. And at the last minute, he said to his lawyer, just try Miranda. So at 10 o'clock on a Friday night, I received a number of text messages with some of the most explosive photographs and details from Hunter Biden's laptop. And immediately I thought it was a good story. I regarded Rudy Giuliani as a legitimate person, a good source. He'd never let me down in anything he'd ever told me before. He'd never lied to me. Others in the media have gone out of their way to traduce him and discredit him, but in my personal experience, he'd been a perfectly sound source. So I spent the next day speaking to Rudy Giuliani and his lawyer, Bob Costello, who had spent the last, say, 3 months, since August 26th, when they received a copy of this laptop, until when I was talking to him in early October. They had done a lot of due diligence on it. They had gone through the hard drive and figured out, both of them being former prosecutors, what the crimes were on the hard drive pertaining to Joe Biden. Because Hunter Biden's laptop spans 9 years, which includes the 8 years of Joe Biden's vice presidency. And Hunter Biden with his crack-addicted, middle-aged son, aged, in his 40s and 50s during this period. And he was involved in a long-running family scheme with Joe Biden's brother to monetize Joe Biden's influence around the world. And this was an influence peddling scheme that Joe Biden and his brother had been running since Joe Biden's earliest days as a senator for Delaware 4 decades earlier. But when he became vice president, he internationalized it and the money became far greater. We are talking about tens of millions of dollars that flowed from Russia, China, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Romania, and so on into the coffers of the Biden family and their associates in America.
So before we dive into that and see how the princeling, as the Chinese would put it, managed to seduce the Biden family, you as a journalist, you get this story. It's a huge thing. The laptop has a hard drive. The amount of sources you quote in the book from the laptop. How did you manage? How long did it take you to get the story out, the first installment?
So took us really less than a week. And the reason for that, I just have to explain, is that my brilliant colleague, Emma Jo Morris, she didn't have the hard drive, but she had been told through an associate of Rudy Giuliani, Steve Bannon, about the existence of the hard drive or the laptop. And she had made contact with Bob Costello, who'd given her, some of the same material that I had been given, more voluminously, some more emails and so on. She had been working on that herself, but in the bowels of the New York Post, it ended up going to the lawyers, and it was just sat there for a while. And Rudy Giuliani and Bob Costello were getting quite desperate because they're talking about, it's now September, it's now October, it's the election is in November 3rd, and obviously they were doing this on behalf of Donald Trump, which of course is another reason why we at the Post were cautious and why other media were cautious, because this was obviously it was laced with politics. It was before an election. Everyone was being cautious. But still, I mean, I'm just coming at it as just a dumb old police reporter. I look at the material and I think this is pretty bombshell. And I had a very good relationship with the boss, the editor-in-chief, who was an Australian who I had worked with in Australia and who had brought me over to New York to work at the Post. And so I, after ascertaining just the bare minimum of due diligence on this, but just having quizzed the two people who knew the most about it and having figured out the provenance of the material, which was from a laptop repair guy in Delaware who had contacted Rudy Giuliani in August, having tried and failed to contact various Republican lawmakers, and that he was a legitimate guy and had seen a few emails from him, etc. So this was just the preliminary work. So then I called Col Allen, my Australian boss. He thought it was interesting. And basically the next day it was all systems go. Emma Jo Morris, my colleague, got the green light. And so she did most of the grunt work on this and broke that first story. And the stories that we ran in that week came from, it really originated from the sleuthing of John Paul MacIsaac, the laptop repair shop owner. He was quite brilliant in his forensic examination of the laptop, which, remember, he'd had since April 2015.
15.
April 20. Sorry, what did I say?
19. I think 19.
No, he gave it to,
He gave it to the FBI on December
2019. And he'd had it in April 2019, yes, so he'd had it for many months. He had come into, after Hunter had abandoned it at his store and not paid his $85 bill in April of 2019. After a couple of months, it became the legal property of John Paul MacIsaac because of the receipt that Hunter Biden had signed. And so John Paul MacIsaac in his spare time started having a look at it. And he saw material on there that he found disturbing because he was watching at the same time on television stories unfolding about the impeachment of Donald Trump over Ukraine. And he could see some parallels with the laptop. For instance, the name of the corrupt energy company, Burisma, that had been paying Hunter Biden $1 million a year to sit on its board. And he felt that there was material in here that was crucial to national security. He saw all the amount of money that was going through to Hunter Biden and Jim Biden. And so he wanted to get the authorities interested, and he trusted the FBI at that stage. So he made several attempts to contact them. And finally, they did come to his office in December and they collected, with a subpoena, they collected the laptop, and it was never seen again. This is the other strand of the story, is the FBI cover-up.
And isn't it just poetic if you think that this is Trump's team coming to journalists with a story which you verify, find true, and try to get out to the media and then get blocked by Twitter, while on the other side of this same presidency, at the beginning of the presidency, Hillary Clinton's campaign comes up with a fake story about Russian collusion, and everybody buys it, and the FBI goes wild with it. And here they just completely buried the story and left Biden unscratched. So how, still there are people, I have friends in America who have either not heard of the laptop or say, well, it's just Hunter's, drugs, and that's not interesting. So how can you walk us through how the media managed to discredit, block, and otherwise smother this story?
Yeah, the Russia collusion story is an umbrella that covers not just the sort of lies about Donald Trump being a stooge of Vladimir Putin who rigged the 2016 election for him. It also encompasses the laptop, because just a few days after we published our first story in the New York Post and were blocked by Twitter, a group of 51 former intelligence officials, mostly from the CIA, including 5 former CIA directors or acting directors, they wrote this very dishonest letter, which claimed
that fingerprints of John Brennan all over it. It's just him.
Exactly. Former CIA director John Brennan. He I believe he was one of those who orchestrated this, because it was his former chief of staff who was contacting people. But it was also former FBI director Leon Panetta, Michael Hayden,
Clapper.
Clapper, the usual suspects. And so they wrote this dishonest letter saying that the laptop was Russian disinformation, or, they used different words. They said had all the earmarks of a Russian information operation. And hilariously now they're trying to use that as a get out of jail free card that they never said it was Russian disinformation. Yes, they did. That was the way it was interpreted by everybody in the media and by Joe Biden, who conveniently used that letter to get off the hook 3 days later when he had his final debate against Donald Trump. And of course, Donald Trump brought up our story, and Joe Biden used the letter to say the intelligence community has said this is nothing but a Russian plant, and turned the stakes back on to Donald Trump. And so the FBI as well used the pretended internally that this was somehow the laptop that they had in their possession was somehow Russian disinformation. And it wasn't just that they had the laptop in their possession. Also closer to the election, basically in late October of 2020, or it may have been early November, and it was about a week before the election, one of Hunter Biden's former business partners, Tony Bobulinski, came forward to the FBI because he was concerned. He was a patriot, a former naval veteran, and had been concerned about what he had seen about the Biden operation and how he thought that with regards to China, that it was damaging to America's national security. So he came forward before the election, went public and went to the FBI because he wanted the American people to be warned about the nature of one of the candidates for president, Joe Biden. He had a 5.5-hour interview at the FBI Washington field office. He handed over the contents of 3 of his phones. He was told that he would be contacted afterwards. He never heard from them again. His information also was buried, and we know it was because FBI whistleblowers have come forward to Republican members of Congress and have said that internally, material pertaining to the laptop or anything to do with Hunter Biden was basically ruled off limits, put into a sort of a locked, metaphorically locked case, and people were warned off that this was disinformation. So it was a concerted effort. And then we also know the FBI's involvement with, now we know this only in the last couple of months, the FBI's involvement in the censorship of our story, the New York Post story, back in October of 2020. And we know that from a couple of sources. One is the Twitter files, and another is
God bless Elon Musk.
Bless Elon Musk, exactly. And there's also a lawsuit by the Attorneys General of Missouri and Louisiana, which is a free speech lawsuit, which has also uncovered a whole lot of malfeasance by the FBI, operating behind the scenes, as we see in the Twitter files, to pressure Twitter and Facebook to censor our story. And they did that by planting a seed, by sort of pre-bunking our story, and saying that, telling Twitter to expect a sort of disinformation, a hack and leak operation by a state actor, aka Russia. And it would come probably in October and probably relate to Hunter Biden. And that's why within a couple of hours of our story, being pressing the button on it and then going live on the morning, we were censored, and Twitter and Facebook immediately recognized our story as the story that they had been warned about for weeks, maybe months, by the FBI. They had the idea had been planted in their minds that this was Russian disinformation, and so they just scrambled to find any old excuse to censor and suppress it. Facebook said that it was being suppressed pending fact-checking, which we believe they never did, because the most obvious way you'd fact-check is contact other people who were on the emails that we published, and they didn't, because we'd been talking to those people. And Twitter censored us, locked the New York Post account for 2 weeks, more than 2 weeks before the election, because it said we had violated their hacking policies. Nothing about our stories was hacked. Nothing about the laptop was hacked.
And at about the same time, they published hacked material of Donald Trump's tax returns or whatever. So it was a stunning moment, and I'm frustrated that people here don't understand how this is. My interpretation of what has been going on in 5 years is that the main story is the press. All these investigations, it's not that the press has become subordinate to law enforcement, it's that law enforcement has become the investigative arm of the press. It's in here, we see it here in Israel too. It's not, the investigations are not leading anywhere criminal. They're just producing dirt and handing it over in leaks to the press. So this was the tell-all moment. I just want to underline what you said, because what this means is that the FBI was sitting on information it knew was damaging to Joe Biden.
Yeah.
It was determined to save his presidency, his bid for the presidency. And when it realized, I think because of they eavesdropped on Rudy Giuliani, right? His cloud. When they realized that the laptop is going to come out, this is election interference, right? They preempted your story in order to bury it. Now, why is this not raising hell in America?
Yeah, Gadi, you just mentioned something really crucial I just want to emphasize as well, which is also something I only discovered a few months ago, which was that Rudy Giuliani was being covertly surveilled by the FBI. He was being spied on. His cloud was being spied on from about a month after he became Donald Trump, then President Donald Trump's personal lawyer, right through 2020. And so when he contacted us at the New York Post, they would have had access to my messages with him, basically saying to him, look, we're going to do it. Don't give it to anyone else. It's great, and you wouldn't have to be very smart to figure out when we were publishing, which was imminently. And they also would have had access to the email that came through to him on August 26th of 2020 from John Paul MacIsaac. And that email was chapter and verse about what was in the laptop. In fact, I mean, our first week of stories was contained pretty much in that email from John Paul MacIsaac, who'd had months to go through, had pulled out the pertinent emails from Ukraine. And so the FBI knew all that, and they were obviously they knew that the story was now out. So their next port of call was to ensure that it was stifled, and they did that through the social media companies. The reason that this story is only known by half of America is because America is now so siloed between conservative and left-wing media. And so the most prestigious media is the New York Times and the Washington Post, and of course then the broadcast media, CBS, NBC, CNN, MSNBC, that their entire agenda is run by what's on the front page of the New York Times. And internationally, I know from my friends in Australia, they get their all their news about America is modulated through that New York Times, Washington Post filter. And so they don't know about this story either, because those organs that feed the world American news and that supposedly inform half of America, they ignored this story from the beginning. First of all, they ran the messages that that traduced the story. Then they ran a few stories about poor Hunter Biden being a drug addict, and then they ignored it until 19 months after our first story came out.
Let me show you their sly. It's a cheating operation. This is. Can you see this on the screen?
Yeah.
Trump said to be warned that Giuliani was conveying Russian disinformation. That's how they reported the story. That's just plain deceiving their audience. It's unbelievable, because by then the story was verified, right? You had information. Peter Schweizer had information. Tucker Carlson had information. Bablinski had come out, and so the story was by then verified. And am I exaggerating to say they just lied to their readers?
They lied to their readers. And they did so by taking the word of anonymous FBI, CIA intelligence sources, naively, pretending to be naive, doing the opposite of what journalism is supposed to do, and just parroted those talking points, that narrative that was being constructed to discredit the story. And, as you say, we had done enormous corroboration of the material on the laptop. It's not, everything I've written is not just from the laptop. The laptop itself is not alone. It's just a guidepost. And Tony Bobulinski's material corroborates and duplicates a lot of what's on the laptop and augments it, because he also has encrypted messages, WhatsApp messages with Hunter Biden and their other partners. And then another third piece of that corroboration jigsaw puzzle is crucial, and that was the investigation done by two Republican senators, Chuck Grassley and Ron Johnson. And they had done a terrific job, particularly piecing together the money trail. They'd gone and got from the Treasury Department a whole lot of suspicious activity reports pertaining to the Bidens, and those are reports that banks are obliged to give to the Treasury if they see, money coming into American bank accounts from suspect sources, whether they be corrupt oligarchs or sanctioned countries or whatever. And the Bidens had multiple dozens of these suspicious activity reports, and from those you could again duplicate and corroborate what was on the laptop with invoices and bank statements that are on the laptop. So it was a pretty slam dunk operation. And also I had spoken to a number of the people who were on those emails and Hunter Biden's business partners. So we were very satisfied that everything we'd done was legit and above board. And this was available to, the vast resources of the New York Times newsroom. They could have done a lot, but they chose not to until 19 months later. They published on an inside page in the 26th paragraph a little line that said that they'd authenticated the laptop and, or emails on the laptop was real. And this was like a thunderbolt. Suddenly the Washington Post was scrambling, CNN was scrambling. They're all coming out with their stories, pretending that they hadn't ignored the story for the last, year and a half. And they always, when they wrote these stories, they had this boilerplate paragraph down low, and it said, there is no evidence that Joe Biden knew anything about his son's business dealings. And this, of course, was the lie that Joe Biden kept telling the American people during the campaign in 2020. He would say, if he was ever asked, or if he ever allowed anybody from the conservative media to get near him, he would say, no, I know nothing about my son Hunter's overseas business dealings. And that was a lie, provably, because we have photographs, we have evidence from the laptop and elsewhere that Joe Biden not only knew about it, he met with Hunter Biden's overseas business partners. He met them in Beijing. He met them in Mexico. He met them in Washington, D.C. In fact, one night in April of 2015, he went to dinner at an Italian restaurant called Cafe Milano in Georgetown with Hunter and Hunter Biden's business partners from 3 countries, from Russia, from Ukraine, and from Kazakhstan. And he had denied that. That was our initially with our first story, we thought that was just a meeting. But over the next few months after the election, I discovered it wasn't just a meeting, it was a dinner. And Joe Biden's campaign had denied that there had been any such meeting. But when the Washington Post tried to fact check and debunk my story about the dinner, they went to the White House, and lo and behold, the White House admitted, oh, yes, Joe Biden did attend that dinner, but he only went for a short time and it was not for any nefarious purpose. Even that was a lie because he stayed for the entire dinner.
But it's more than that, because it's not just that he knew, he was the real point of the business. Nobody does business with Hunter, and it's only Hunter's ability to produce Joe Biden even for a minute to just let his partners at CEFC, who are an extension of Chinese intelligence, know that they're putting their money in the right place. So it's a huge lie. It's not a technical lie.
No, it's a huge lie. He was the product they were selling. He was aware of it, and he made himself available whenever Hunter or Jim Biden, his brother, needed him. For instance, I haven't finished this story yet, but I will be breaking it soon. I believe, I've been told, that Joe Biden Hunter used to put his father on the speakerphone when he was trying to close a deal. He was available. He'd be in Paris, or he'd be in Dubai, or he'd be somewhere around the world with these prospective business partners or current business partners, and just to reassure them that he had a hotline to his father, he literally put his father on the speakerphone on the table.
Before we get to the actual corruption, which is, I think, this should have been a headline story, because obviously, by the facts you expose in your book, this is probably the most corrupt president ever to sit in the White House. I don't remember any teapot, any scandal to come near this. But there is also in your book, it's a good opportunity to now be able to actually show it on the screen. Here it is. Laptop from hell, Hunter Biden, big tech, and the dirty secrets the president tried to hide. The book also reads a little like a novel, because, I started this with great hostility to Hunter Biden. He doesn't look very good in the media, in the conservative media, when you read it. But as you go along, you think, oh, this poor soul, there's no friction with reality, ever. Nothing has any consequences. And he's always being the victim. And he's actually this mule for his family. And it's I don't know, it's like the underside of a Shakespearean tragedy. So what's your sense of this guy? Who is Hunter Biden?
Yeah, he is, I think, an object of pity. He had a very tragic start to life. His mother was killed in a car crash along with his baby sister, and Hunter and his slightly older brother, Bo, who were aged 2 and 3, were quite badly injured. And I think it gives you an insight into what sort of a person Joe Biden is, that he had just been elected senator for the first time. He was 29 when he was elected, 30 years old. His wife had died. His sons were in hospital, and he chose to invite the media into their hospital room to get sworn in. And so that iconic image now of Joe Biden being sworn in, and in the foreground are his two injured sons, one with a broken leg, one with a bandaged head, just lying there wanly in a hospital bed. And Joe Biden has used that photograph in every campaign since. You know, he could have been sworn in the corridor or out the front. He didn't have to get sworn in with those little boys in the foreground, but of course it was an extremely useful image. And Americans who are very kind-hearted, as you would know, and generous people, they just were so empathetic to him from then on. That was cemented. Anything that Joe Biden did was forgiven because of the great tragedy that he had suffered. And it really was a tragedy. I mean, no one's taking that away. But he has exploited it enormously. And then Hunter Biden writes in his own memoir about how he and his brother were really brought up by everybody. Joe Biden obviously was from a big Irish family, and they were living in they lived in Delaware, Pennsylvania, but he was Joe Biden made a big deal about how he was a single dad, a widowed father, and he would commute every day backwards and forwards on Amtrak to Washington and back to his boys. But the fact was that he really only, whether or not he did come home every night, he certainly wasn't home in time. You know, he was able just to give them a kiss goodnight. They were really brought up by his sister, who sacrificed her marriage to bring up those boys. And they loved her. Hunter particularly speaks very fondly of her and is very angry with his father for sort of disrespecting her and not giving her the credit for what she did as basically his second mother. And also Joe's mother, Hunter's grandmother, brought them up as well. So, but having a father like Joe, who was prone to bursts of temper, who was, absent, who was concentrating on a very big career. He was rapidly, as a very young person, who attached himself to some pretty unsavory Democrats who were really the worst of the sort of bigoted Southerners. He was elevated quite quickly as their tool and got chairmanships of very powerful committees, and was captured early on as the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee by the Chinese. He was invited to China, to Martha's Vineyard, the equivalent of Chinese Martha's Vineyard, and was at the very first part of his career, and was feted and duchessed to a point when he came back, and he was pilloried in the conservative media. The Weekly Standard said it was an incredible embarrassment because he was gushing about China. But so Joe was sort of absent. Hunter was pretty much left to his own devices. He had this perfect older brother, Bo, who he looked up to, but simultaneously resented. He started in that very affluent part of Delaware, where he went to a private school that his father had gone to. He fell in with the sort of cool crowd that did drugs all the time. And so he was very early on drinking and taking drugs. He was, in fact, arrested. He was in his final year of school for, I think, cocaine or some sort of drug use. And that was wiped to clear off his record. And then later on, he continued on with it off and on. It was a pretty heavy drug problem when he finally joined the Navy at the very ripe old age. I think he was like 40, got special dispensation through his father. He was thrown out on his first weekend after testing positive to drugs. So he was a troubled person. And I think another just one illuminating moment is you think about what sort of a father Joe Biden was. What kind of a father would put his drug-addicted son in front of just a gushing torrent of unaccountable cash? And that was what the money from Ukraine and China was. And he was his family's bad man. Hunter wanted to be an artist, he wanted to be an author, and yet his father insisted that he take these grace and favour jobs that his father had organised through his lavish donors in Delaware, jobs that Hunter didn't want to do, but he was paid an inflated salary for, and a salary that he complained bitterly that he had to share 50-50 with his father, and that he had to basically support the entire extended family.
So the experience of the reader of your book is the first chapters. You learn about Hunter spending tens of thousands of dollars a night on crack and call girls, and still drowning in self-pity. And this is a very strange cocktail until I think you understand as you read the book. And this is it's almost a novelistic development. Is you understand that there's something terrible about this family where a father grooms the older brother to be his heir, and the other brother is just the cash mule, and how humiliating it is. And just the contrast between the humiliation and the jet set life is mind-boggling. This is the perverted version of Camelot, because everything it's petty thievery. It's not like grand Joe Kennedy schemes. It's just Delaware petty conmen. It's just ridiculous in a way. All these diamonds and CFC and all these people. So
it's grifters. They're grifters.
Yeah, grifters is the word. I didn't have the word in English. And this deserves a drama series one day when we get far enough from the politics. Yeah. But I want to take the last section of our conversation to the actual corruption, because these are incredible schemes. And so China, I think the China stuff is the most dangerous. And again, the contrast is mind-boggling between the fuss they made about some Alpha Bank one email something when it was Trump, and there you have the Biden family just in cahoots with Chinese intelligence. So what is the story of CFC?
Well, CFC is described often as just a Chinese energy company, but in fact it's much more. It is the capitalist arm of President Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative, his central plan to basically take over the world. It's an imperialist plan. He goes to smaller countries. He bribes officials. He buys up infrastructure. He basically traps them in debt traps, and then he owns them. Effectively, that's the way it works. And CFC was what it did was it would go to, say, places like Kazakhstan or Romania or even places
Chad,
in Europe.
I think.
Yeah. Chad, and would buy up mines or energy infrastructure. And by this stage, you're talking about countries I think were a bit wise to China and were a bit reluctant compared to maybe how they would have been a few years before to go into business with China. But when CFC came hand in hand with the Biden family, the vice president of the United States, that changed everything. So doors opened. And that's really all CFC wanted, was the imprimatur of the Biden name. And that's what they were paying for. And for the last 2 years of Joe Biden's vice presidency, Hunter and his various business partners were traveling around the world, opening doors for CFC. And Hunter was very important. They would wheel him out. No matter how drug affected he was, he would manage to present himself well enough and clean up and come and give a speech to a bunch of people in a boardroom. And that was enough. That was all they wanted. So he was doing a lot of flying around the world at that time. The money, one of the ways that the New York Times, for instance, covers up the enormity of this corruption to do with CFC is they say, the money only came through after Joe Biden had finished his vice presidency. You know, he was a private citizen. He was entitled to do what he wanted. Well, I mean, technically that's true. The money from CEFC did start flowing a couple of months after Joe entered his vice presidency. But the work, that was money that they were being paid for work done in the last 2 years of Joe Biden's vice presidency with his knowledge, using his name as vice president to open doors. So, and this was also, Tony Bobulinski was brought in and met Joe Biden twice in Los Angeles to be vetted by Joe Biden as the CEO of this joint venture that the Biden family had with CEFC. And that was done again just a few weeks after Joe's vice presidency had ended. But again, this was just to formalise an informal arrangement that had already been going on. And Joe Biden was set to become a partner with Hunter in CEFC America. And Hunter actually got nameplates made up with his father's name on it. He asked the office manager in Washington for his office to cut new keys for his father and his stepmother, Jill Biden. And of course, that all fell apart because after the Trump administration came in, they started cracking down on various Chinese infiltration of America. And that meant that the FBI arrested one of Hunter's business partners from CEFC, a man called Patrick Ho, who'd been bribing United Nations African officials. And he was arrested and he was sentenced, and then he was later shipped out of the country. And really nothing much was made of that story, but it implicated the Bidens very deeply in this corrupt scheme, and they were quite panicked. You can see on the laptop they were quite panicked after Patrick Ho was arrested. The whole CEFC ended up being closed down. An enormous multi-billion-dollar deal that CEFC had just struck with Russia to buy out a big chunk of the Russian state-owned energy company, that collapsed as well, and China had to pay Russia some compensation. And that all collapsed because Patrick Ho was arrested at JFK Airport. And Hunter, you can see, is panicking at this stage. His money's fallen apart, but also there's a concern that the New York Times has been sniffing around about CEFC and Hunter Biden's very close relationship with the chief executive, who was connected to military intelligence, a guy called Chairman Yi. And there's an interesting voicemail that popped up on the laptop, and it's from Joe Biden to his son. And he's just read the New York Times article that they'd all been panicking about. And he said, "Oh, it's okay. I think you're clear that, I read the story." And that just expressed the relief that the New York Times kind of thanks, I think, in part to Hunter's lawyer, George Maizière, and who knows who else, who'd been communicating with the New York Times and their journalist and probably the editors. They'd sort of massaged the story to really downplay and remove most references to Joe Biden. I have talked to the reporter. He says, look, we really didn't find very much else to do with Joe Biden. But I believe him, but I don't know what other, pressure was applied to the Times.
So just to be clear, this is happening under Trump's administration. There is an FBI, under Bill Barr, there is an FBI investigation of CEFC. Then they find the laptop, still under Bill Barr, under Trump. They're covering it up before the election. These are Trump's appointments, right? They're just undermining Trump deliberately.
Yes, and also under Bill Barr, the FBI was spying on the President Donald Trump's personal lawyer. So how much Bill Barr knew about this, I don't know. I do know he fired mysteriously. No one really has explained why. He fired Jeffrey Berman, who was the head of the Southern District of New York, which is a pretty big step to take, because the Southern District of New York is it's called the Sovereign District of New York. It's probably the most powerful law enforcement center in the country, and very proud of its independence. So Bill Barr must have been enraged to do that. I don't know why. I mean, there's speculation that it was because he wasn't told that they were spying on Rudy Giuliani, and he should have been told. There are other speculations as well, but I don't know how much Bill Barr knew. I do know from someone who bumped into him recently that he was shocked about the revelations about the FBI covering up the story of the laptop. And that was early on. That was when the first FBI whistleblowers started coming out. So it could be the case that Bill Barr was kept in the dark. I don't know.
Last questions. Do you think now Kevin McCarthy is the Speaker of the House, he holds the gavel, will these outrageous scandals start to see the light of day under a Republican Congress, House?
I have a lot of faith, having spoken to some of the people involved in investigating it, and the committee chairman are really determined, and they're pretty tough. There's a guy called James Comer who's doing one of the investigations, and he's written off by the left-wing media as a bit of a hick. He has a southern accent. He has a very sort of genteel way of speaking. But I haven't met him yet, but I'm told he's extremely smart and sort of deceptive, a bit like that Detective Columbo on the TV series. He's got a mind like a steel trap, and he is going after Joe Biden. He's made it very clear, Republicans, all of them have made it very clear, this is not about Hunter Biden. This is about the corruption of Joe Biden and how it has damaged America's national security, particularly when it comes to China. And, potentially when it comes to Ukraine as well.
Well, shame on the Pulitzer Prize Committee that they gave it to the New York Times and the Washington Post, and not to you, Miranda. This is the story of the century. I've tried to write about it here. They were caused to shut down my column because it's fake news. Yeah. It's here. It hasn't penetrated. So I'm so happy that you made the time to speak to us. Thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you so much, Gabby.
Good night. Dad.